Was plus Dutch for cheers. There we go. And we're live. Welcome to Beyond Binary, everyone, where we look to find some nuance in the debate. And today we're going to be looking at modern monetary theory, so a bit of economics. Today are joined by Sam and Tony. So guys, would you like to introduce yourselves? Maybe Sam, you can go first. Who are you? What do you do? And tell us about any organizations you work for, any kind of websites or orgs you want to give a shout to.
Absolutely. So I'm Sam Kangarloo. My academic background is in multidisciplinary social sciences, history, sociology, government, and philosophy. I'm a subject matter expert on modern monetary theory. I correspond with a number of MMT economists with whom I have relationships where I pose challenges, inquiries, and where we workshop various ideas connected to MMT. In particular, I've kept up a semi-regular correspondence with MMT founder and pioneer Warren Mosler. At one point not too long ago, I turned Dr. Cornel West onto MMT. I'm involved with several MMT advocacy groups and organizations, including the organization Real Progressives, run by its founder, Stephen Grumbine. I engage with parliamentary politics as a progressive, and in that capacity, I've worked to support and advocate and volunteer for various progressive political campaigns here in the United States, most recently for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and prior to that for a number of proto-Bernie presidential campaigns in various capacities, including policy advocacy, most notably the Dennis Kucinich for president campaign and twice for Ralph Nader. Now, that being said, I should also point out that the underlying political philosophy or ideology to which I subscribe is libertarian socialism, which, as many in your audience will probably know, is just a polite term for anarchism. My advocacy for progressive politics and anarchist principles to which I adhere, and my understanding of MMT form a synthesis that I think offers a very cohesive and practically actionable way to alleviate as much suffering as possible, as quickly as possible under our world's current socioeconomic reality, while simultaneously moving us toward a post-capitalist world before, frankly, humanity finds itself in a situation where ecological and socioeconomic breakdown reach a point of no return. Thanks, guys.
Very succinct. Excellent. Thank you. And Tony, one time, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Tony. I run the YouTube channel One Dime, spelled number 1 DIME. You can maybe guess what it refers to, maybe based on the descriptions of my videos. But it's basically a YouTube channel primarily focused on subjects related to political economy, political philosophy, and critical theory bridged with popular topics. Really, mainly the goal of the channel is to spread anti-capitalist ideas and socialist ideas. And I'm very pluralistic in the type of theories I approach, as long as they're useful at elucidating certain phenomena. And as Sam mentioned, MMT is also a big subject that I like to explore. I've made multiple videos regarding on MMT. Most famously is the deficit myth video. It's called The Deficit Myth, the Biggest Lie in Politics. That is, after studying MMT for about a year, not nearly as long as Sam has, but I found it to be very mind-blowing, very interesting, and very essential for people to learn. So I decided to make a video about that and to explain it as best as I possibly could. And I ran it by a bunch of MMT people also. And I've also run a podcast called One Dime Radio, where I interview and have conversations with a wide variety of people. I've had conversations with some MMT people as well, like Philip Armstrong on things like inflation. I also talk about automation, a wide variety of issues. Really, I would go check out the channel. It's made to be accessible to a wide variety of people, but also interesting for those who are the keeners who like to dig into theoretical concepts also. And I also have a knack for fancy video editing, if you're into that. So I try to make it a little bit artistic too. So that's mainly what I do. I do not really claim to be like an expert or anything. I'm more just a YouTuber that tries to explain other people's ideas. And here and there, I'll inject my own opinions too. As for my politics, I would consider myself a socialist, a pluralist, in that I don't really subscribe to a specific label, although I would put myself closer to the Marxist end. And I hold MMT to be true. MMT as a descriptive theory, which tends to be kind of rare among Marxists these days. But I'm sure we'll get more into that through this conversation.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for the introduction. So maybe we can kick off with a brief explanation of what MMT is. We all probably know about it to varying degrees, but for the kind of casual listener who's maybe stumbled upon the podcast, maybe Sam, you could give a brief introduction.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I can give you the sort of all the MMT fundamental high level insights in about 10 to 12 minutes. You want to give that a go?
Let's go for it. Yeah.
All right. So first and foremost, what people need to understand is that MMT is not something that is done. Okay. It is a thoroughly empirical project. Therefore, it is descriptive and not prescriptive. That makes it something that can be grafted onto literally any number of political ideologies and orientations, from liberalism to conservatism, from progressivism to Trumpism, from fascism to socialism, and any other ones you can think of. So to quote preeminent MMT scholar and economist Bill Mitchell, who comes out of Marxism, by the way, MMT is not a regime that you apply or switch to or introduce. Rather, MMT is a lens which allows us to see the true intrinsic workings of the fiat monetary system. It helps us better understand the choices available to a currency issuing government. It is not a regime, but an accurate perspective on reality. So what then are the central insights or revealed truths that MMT demonstrates to be the case? Okay, so here I'll give high level MMT fundamentals. And then, as we're going through the discussion, we can go into greater detail on any of these as needed. So first and foremost, starts with the question of money. And money is a creature of the state, okay, or some other issuing authority. It was not born of barter, nor does it represent barter, as we've all been raised to think, and that so many economists get wrong. And even Karl Marx missed that one. So the barter story of money is a myth. That's where MMT starts. And this realization about what money actually is and how it functions is known as chartalism. That's the technical term for it. For the folks in your audience, you can Wikipedia that, you can Google that. And it's been corroborated by anthropologists the world over long before MMT came to fruition back in 1996. Chartalism predates MMT. Which really starts in MMT really starts in 96. The most notable anthropologist probably to corroborate, or at least in recent period, to corroborate that MMT claim is the recently deceased David Graeber, who in his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, proved, among many other things, exactly that MMT claim. But as I said, he's not the only anthropologist to have proven that. So what is money then, right? So it's three things. It's a social unit of account. It is a promise to pay, therefore it is an IOU. And it is a tax credit, which I realize is not self-explanatory, but I can flesh that out throughout the discussion. Second thing is that, so what is currency then, right? Currency is just the state's money, all right? It's a public monopoly, which is also very critical to understanding MMT. And let's look at 5 things that bracket out from that, this idea, or as we would say, this empirical fact that currency being the state's money and is a public monopoly, right? So the funds to pay taxes come from the state, right? You don't have the funds to pay your taxes unless the state injects them into the economy. So that's 1. 2, state spending precedes the payment of taxes and the purchase of state securities, otherwise known as bonds. So in other words, spending precedes taxation and bond purchasing. We don't tax and then spend. We don't sell bonds and then spend, as the mainstream economic view has led us all to understand, and is what we were all raised on. 3, state spending is limited only by what tax liabilities cause to be offered for sale. And again, we can flesh some of this out during the discussion, but I'll repeat it because I know that some of this might get a little like, But state spending is limited only by what tax liabilities cause to be offered for sale. So it's the tax liability itself that creates unemployment. And that's the next point. That's 4. Tax liabilities are, to begin with, the cause of unemployment. Again, we'll get into that. Price level, and the last thing about currencies is the state money, and it's a public monopoly. The price level is a function of prices paid by the state when it spends. So what happens is markets have to set relative prices, but relative to what? Relative to the currency monopolist. Who is the currency monopolist? It is the political sovereign. It is the, quote, state in the nation state sense, right? Second fundamental insight. A country that is fully monetarily sovereign does not finance federal spending with tax dollars, which I alluded to in the public monopoly points. What that means is that the government does not actually tax in order to spend, as I mentioned, nor does it actually borrow in order to spend, meaning bonds do not function to finance government spending. Monetarily sovereign nations spend money into existence through their federal legislative bodies, as do ones that are not monetarily sovereign. And I'll tell you what. We'll get into what that means, that term, to be monetarily sovereign and the degrees of monetary sovereignty. Mm-hmm. But that means that as issuers of a currency that they have complete control over, they spend first, and when they tax, those tax dollars are actually deleted from the economy, again, empirically. And when we talk about modern monetary theory as theory, and I want to just put a little ellipses in all of this here to make this point clear. We're not using theory in the vernacular sense. So theory in the vernacular means hypothesis. The way that the average person on the street talking about a theory, when they use that word, what they actually mean, whether they realize it or not, is hypothesis. So we're using theory in the scientific sense, which is
like the theory of evolution, right? It's
exactly.
Not just an untested thing. We've verified that it happened, kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. It's the next closest. It's the closest you can get to a law, right? And in economics, the only laws that exist in the field of economics is that your subject will die. That's the only law in economics, is that the subject will die. That's it. So your agent, your economic agent, your conscious economic agents, which make an economy possible, human beings, have a finite lifespan and that they will die. That is actually the only law in economics. So to get back to, okay, those tax dollars are actually deleted from the economy. Your federal tax dollars do not pay for any federal spending whatsoever. Let me repeat that. In the United States, in Canada, in all fully monetarily sovereign nations, your federal tax dollars do not pay for any federal spending whatsoever. UK, Canada, Russia, all the Scandinavian countries, on and on and on. Federal tax dollars don't pay for any federal spending whatsoever. That includes your payroll taxes. So for example, in the US, that's Medicare and Social Security. Medicare, the taxes you pay on Medicare and Social Security do not fund those programs. And that bit, by the way, was well understood by the Roosevelt administration when they introduced the Social Security program. And look, guys, I realize that all of that begs a lot of questions, like what about all the money I keep hearing we owe the Chinese? But again, we can cover some of this in detail during the discussion. I think it is important now, however, to define, what a fully monetarily sovereign nation is, because I've used that term. So a fully monetary sovereign nation is one that meets 4 criteria, okay? It issues its own currency. It taxes only in its own currency. Therefore, it must not be taxing its population in a currency other than its own. And it issues liabilities. The third thing is it issues liabilities denominated only in its own currency. In other words, when it issues a bond, it only issues that bond in its own currency and not in another currency. And the fourth thing is it lets its currency float. All right. Therefore, the currency isn't pegged to anything like gold or silver or another currency.
So, for example, of that would be like the UK economy, no, which used to be backed by sterling silver, hence the name pound sterling, but then it was depegged from sterling. Right. So it's kind of a floating economy. It's not backed by any one particular thing.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. So the UK is a perfect example of a country, of a nation state that is fully monetarily sovereign. Now, every country on the planet sits somewhere on a range, a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, okay? And Dr. Fadl Kaboub and Scott Fulwiler actually have this 4-point spectrum, like a 1 to 4 of the degree of monetary sovereignty that a nation exhibits based on those criteria. So the more of those criteria it meets, the more fully monetarily sovereign it is. And the more fully monetarily sovereign a nation is, the more flexibility and self-determinism it has in its policy space and in terms of setting the terms for its economy. So let me give some quick examples of countries that are fully monetarily sovereign. Okay, the United States, Canada, the UK, Japan, Australia, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand, Iceland. There are others, Russia, to an extent, China very close to being fully monetarily sovereign, Russia very close. And so for the astute among the audience here, they'll notice that I haven't mentioned a single country.
Nations.
Right, exactly. And there's a good reason for that. And we can discuss that a little bit throughout. We can bring that up throughout the discussion. But this does not, however, mean that nothing I've said means that governments cannot spend without constraint, even if they're fully monetarily sovereign. There is a constraint. It's just not revenue. Okay, it's not tax dollars, since those tax dollars don't actually fund federal spending. The constraint is real resource availability. When the spending in an economy, otherwise known as aggregate demand in econ speak, okay, outstrips the amount of goods and services being produced, and there aren't enough available resources, meaning land, labor, capital, machinery, to meet that increased spending, you get inflationary pressure, which can lead to actual inflation. Too much inflation, you're going to get a general rise in prices, can severely hamper the value of people's money as prices rise, and the current, well, I should say, can severely hamper the purchasing power of people's money as prices rise and the purchasing power of the currency falls very quickly, especially relative to growth, and that degrades the ability of people to meet their material needs. And that's known as demand pull inflation, the kind of inflationary pressure that I just described. There's also cost push inflation, and there's the cost push inflationary pressure, sectoral inflationary pressure. Not going to get into right now, but we can talk about throughout the discussion. There's also inflation as a result of price gouging, which is the primary source right now for inflation in the United States. But all of this suggests correctly a number of things, including that inflation is actually really not that easy to generate in an economy with a lot of monetary sovereignty. And everything I've mentioned in that second insight means that governments do not and should not function like households. This is an important thing for your audience to internalize. You and I have to balance our budget, or we have to borrow. This is not the case for governments, nor should it be, okay? Lest they create the pressures for an otherwise unnecessary economic crisis. And I can't emphasize that enough. When governments treat themselves like households, they are creating the pressure for economic crises, okay? So that's an appropriate segue for the third fundamental insight of MMT, which is what's known as sectoral balances, okay? By virtue of the public sector, therefore the government, spending money into existence, therefore into an economy, which is how money gets into an economy, the government, the legislative body of that political sovereign, has to literally spend it into existence, okay? Then the government's yearly budget deficits are the economy's yearly surpluses, and the government's national debt, which by definition is the sum total of all budget deficits and surpluses that government has ever run, okay? By definition, that national debt is the national savings of the economy, of the private sector. So the national debt is not really debt at all in the way that we think of debt. When we think of debt, it's something that we owe to somebody that we have to pay, okay? And that's because to think of the reason that we don't want to, it's not accurate to think of it in those terms when it comes to nation states, political sovereigns, anything with a central bank, is because to pay off the national debt would literally mean that there would be no money in the economy. Not hypothetically, literally no money in the economy. And that's another point that anthropologists, including David Graeber, have recognized as a result of research in their own discipline. And it's totally congruent with MMT. The government sector's account balance equals the sum of the non-government sector, namely the private sector and foreign sector, to the penny. So let me make this concrete with a quick example, right? The United States has a so-called national debt of, last I checked, I mean, it's much higher now, but it was like roughly 20 trillion. It's not much higher now, but it is higher than 20. I think it's like 24, $28 trillion, okay? That $28 trillion, the government of the United States has spent into existence since the inception of the country, since 1786. Those are all of the dollars that the United States has spent into existence that they have not spent out of existence through taxation, okay? Then when you examine how many dollars are held in the domestic private economy, that's households and firms, you see that it's roughly like 22, 23 trillion. Okay. The remaining amount is held by foreign entities, and that's our trade deficit. All right. Yeah. Those numbers, that 28 trillion for the federal government, that 23 trillion for the private sector here in the United States, the domestic private sector, and the remainder that's held by foreigners, whether it be foreign firms or foreign individuals, all of that sums to zero. And that's what's known as sectoral balances. It has to sum to zero by accounting identities. And in other words, these are nothing more than empirically true accounting identities. It's why when MMTers explain MMT to certified public accountants, CPAs tend to get it very quick. Much quicker than the general public. They'll say, oh yeah, what you're describing, those are accounting identities. It's just double entry accounting. And that's correct. That's what the central banks of the world use to keep score of their economies. Central banks like the Federal Reserve are literally scorekeepers of an economy. They neither have nor do not have dollars or pounds or yen or anything else. The money is created out of thin air by legislative decree. That's what is meant when you hear the term fiat currency, okay? And the central bank's job in that respect is simply to type those dollars into existence, typing them into existence by appropriating them to the relevant accounts for which the legislative branch has said that's who's going to get the money, okay? And that's how it happens, by the way. All right. It's literally the keyboarding of the currency into existence via computers at the central bank for all of us in the private sector to use. And in the days that preceded information technology, these operations were tracked by paper ledger. Okay. I want to say something about banking. The most common perception is that deposits create loans, that when you make a deposit at a bank, those deposits are used by that bank for lending. The MMT demonstrates that that's not at all true. The loan actually creates the deposit. Private banks, like the ones where we all keep our money, they create money out of thin air when they lend. And that's what's known as bank money. Okay. Right. And they too literally keystroke those dollars into existence. So in this case, into your checking account, right? So the money multiplier story is not borne out by reality. It's just yet another example of how mainstream economics have tried to fit available data to pre-existing models instead of creating models that actually fit the available data. The other thing.
Can I ask you a quick question here? Because it seems to me like it's kind of like you're revealing this kind of like everything's a bit on its head.
It is.
To me, it seems a bit backwards. Like, yeah. But then, I used to be super into like conspiracy theories and stuff, and it makes me think like, who's doing this to us and why? Is that the case, or is it just like that people haven't fully understood like that theory?
I'm so glad you asked that, because that is such an important question, and it's one that when I first got into MMT, I grappled a lot with, and I challenged people on, and I brought it up for discussion often. So here's the thing, right? A lot of it, so it comes down to a number of different ways that I like to think of it and break it down. One is willful ignorance versus simple ignorance, right? So a lot of it is simple ignorance. People simply don't know, including political appointees. They don't know that this is the way that it works. However, if you call people at a certain mid-level position at your local bank, they'll tell you, oh yeah, that's how we do it. If you talk to the Federal Reserve bureaucrats and bean counters, they'll say, yeah, of course, that's what we do. We type those dollars into existence by virtue of what the legislative body, what Congress has just appropriated the funds for. Congress passes a bill, if there's any money tied to that bill, that orders the Treasury to spend that money. How does the Treasury spend that money? By instructing the Federal Reserve to mark up the relevant bank accounts. That's it. And when one of the ways that actually MMT figured all this out is Warren Mosler just spoke to these people at the Federal Reserve and said, hey, listen, how is it that you guys actually get the money to where it needs to go, and who is giving you the order? And they say, well, we just do whatever Congress tells us to do by way of the Treasury. So we're getting our marching orders from the Treasury. The Treasury says spend this many dollars, and the Treasury has a general account at the Federal Reserve, and they say, okay, from our general account, spend this many dollars and give it to this amount of it, this allocation to that construction company, to that high-tech firm, to these Social Security accounts, to those Medicaid accounts, to those Medicare accounts, and that's how the spending is done. They're literally typing it into existence, but it starts with legislation at the congressional level. It's the legislative bodies of political sovereigns that hold the purse strings almost ubiquitously. And in non-democratic countries, okay, it's the dictator. He says, spend this amount of money, but that's still an order that has to be given to the central bank of that country, okay? Mm-hmm. And then when it comes, and all of that money that is spent into existence as a result of congressional appropriations, okay, that's what's known as high-powered money. That's high-powered money. Why? Because it never has to be paid back, ever. Okay, it never has to be paid back. The money that banks create out of thin air when they issue a loan, whether it be to an individual or a firm or to anyone else, that's what's known as bank money. Sometimes you'll hear it called credit money. Those are synonymous terms, okay? That money has a net zero effect on the private economy. Now, why?
It always goes back to the creator.
Exactly.
No?
Exactly.
Whereas it's the opposite is true of money created by the central bank.
Right. And the thing that people have a really tough time wrapping their head around is like, well, wait a minute, but isn't that what taxes are for? And no, because the taxes actually function when taxes are paid, that is a net debit from accounts that is then deleted from the economy. The federal government doesn't then use that money to re-spend, nor does it need it. It never needs it to spend. We can talk more about the function of taxes, but unemployment. The other thing I want to point out here before I wrap up this intro is that unemployment is never an economic inevitability. It's always a political choice. The government can buy as much labor as it wants. Okay. And as far as things that might come close to being like the one thing that might come close to being an intrinsic prescriptive in MMT is the federal jobs guarantee. And that's because MMT notices that a federal jobs guarantee can simultaneously solve the problem of unemployment while maintaining price stability, therefore avoiding inflation. And it's intrinsic to MMT for those reasons, and because it's counter-cyclical, which is just fancy econ speak for that. It contracts and expands with the business cycle, which when we talk about MMT and Marxism throughout the discussion, we can harken back to the business cycle. But taking all of that into account, whenever you hear someone, whether it be a friend, your uncle, or or especially some lawmaker or policymaker in Washington or London or anywhere else say, well, okay, that's all well and good, but how are you going to pay for that? Okay, whether it's single payer healthcare or Green New Deal or a living wage or a federal jobs guarantee or even tax cuts, which we can talk about too, depending on one's politics, whenever that's brought up, the answer should always be literally the same way we've always been paying for all government spending, okay, which is that the legislature passes legislation and the Treasury spends the money by instructing the central bank to mark up the relevant bank accounts. The money is simply always spent into existence. And as long as there are enough goods and services being produced or able to be produced to meet whatever increased demand that new injected money might generate, okay, that new spending might generate, we can afford it.
That's absolutely fascinating. One time, Tony, do you have a question? I could hear you.
I don't think I have a question because I think Sam explained that pretty well as you
Yeah.
could in such a short time. I mean, these are mostly things I covered in my videos on MMT. I think they're very important. If you want, there's things I can add, which I think Sam touched on, but obviously due to time, we weren't really able to elaborate, which I think are kind of integral to like a lot of popular misconceptions about MMT that people tend to
Please.
like always ask us, right?
Mhm.
So if you want me to add those, sure. There's like
Yeah, go ahead.
a bunch of them. I don't have to touch on all of these, but one has to do with the really emphasizing the difference between currency users and currency issuers
Yep.
to the spectrum of currency sovereignty. Because while Sam said some countries are fully currency sovereign or some have full currency sovereignty, we don't actually mean that literally. Like there's no such thing as a full currency sovereignty. Like it's a spectrum, right? So in a globalized world, all countries depend on each other. We all depend on imports to certain degrees. So there'll be things that some countries can produce and thus will need a foreign currency for to purchase from other countries, especially like natural resources. And what differentiates currency sovereignty is also worth it discussing. And then there's bonds as savings accounts. You touched on that, but that's something that's very hard for people to wrap their head around. Is like we think bonds are what is the government obviously borrowing our money, which is not the case. It's a bond is really just a savings account with the Federal Reserve.
That's right.
Yeah. So when you have your money in a bond, for example, it's often considered like a safe investment. The reason why it's safe is because the government can always pay that interest because it's in their own currency. They can literally type that into existence, and it's not your money. That why would they borrow it if they can literally type money into existence to pay you the interest? They're not borrowing it, and this seems obvious, right, when you get it, but you'll see a lot of people say stuff like we're borrowing from China. Even prominent economists, even some Marxist economists will say this very falsely. So it's definitely worth highlighting that. And this is not to say, though, that some people do not use, or some governments do not use bonds to borrow money, right?
That's right.
So for example, this is where the currency issuers versus currency users distinction is so important. And that's because some people will maybe interrupt and say, well, what about our state and municipal governments, right? Or provincial governments? Don't they rely on taxes? Don't they rely on that to pay for their roads? And in Canada, for instance, I think it's similar in the US, but education and healthcare are actually funded pretty much entirely by the state governments, provincial governments through taxes, and rely sometimes here and there on federal government transfers. And it doesn't have to be this way, but that's just the way like our sort of decentralized federalist systems are structured, is that state governments, it's very similar in the US to Canada, but basically provincial and municipal governments actually do use taxes to pay for a lot of their things. And hence why usually the jobs they do on a lot of programs tend to be a lot worse than the federal government. Like it takes forever to like build roads. It takes forever to, build a public transit, unless you're a city that has high levels of capital investment, like, I don't know, Chicago, New York, or something like that. So it's worth highlighting that. And that's because they're currency users. They do not have the authority to create money. They do not have central banks. There's only the Federal Reserve, at least in the U.S., to give that example, is like the central bank. They have the authority to create money. And of course, as Sam mentioned, private banks are the other people who create money. It's a different kind of money, technically speaking, but they create actually most of the money that's in our economy. So, and this is often used ironically enough to help refute MMT, even though it doesn't refute MMT, is that they say, oh, well, actually, most of the money in the economy is created by private banks. And well, yes, private banks create a large amount of the money that we use through credit, right? Giving out loans. But they're able to do that at a pace that is very much determined by the government. And that's determined by interest rates, right? So a narrative you'll hear a lot of people say is during COVID, the government printed tons of money. Well, first of all, not only do the governments not print money, they type it digitally. Most of that money was actually created by private banks. And that was because the government lowered interest rates by basically inflating the reserves of banks that are licensed to create money. And because of inflating the reserves, they lower interest rates, because you lower interest rates or not, really, you manipulate this depending on the amount of money there is in the bank reserves. If they have a lot more, they can lower it to like virtually almost zero. So they can hand out credit like very easily. And this obviously led to like a lot of inflated asset prices, housing prices, stock prices, because people, it's still the banks who are giving out the money, right? So even though they may give it out at like zero interest, they'll give it out to people who they think will be more likely to pay it back sooner, so that they can make a profit on it, off of it. So this leads to a lot of people who are already rich getting a lot of money. So you hear this narrative that MMT, quote unquote, is being used to benefit rich people. I think when you messaged me before this conversation, you said something we want to address. And obviously MMT is not action, right? It's merely a theory to see the way things are. But the reason why you see this like creation, the huge inflation of this huge influx rather of money that is going into the economy that's mostly benefiting rich people, it's because it's the private banks who are ultimately given more the greater role rather in stimulating the economy. And that's a public choice that we can change, depending on our governments, not rather than some sort of inevitability.
So it's the government who has control in deciding like how that money is created, right? Either the treasury can create it, or the central bank, or they can kind of do it on their behalf via these private entities.
Well, let me talk a little bit about where that comes from and clarify a few things. So before we get to that, let me back up to a couple of the things that One Dimension. He's absolutely right that the currency issuer versus currency user distinction is imperative. Okay, all of us, we are currency users. Amazon, Microsoft, all private corporations are currency users. They don't have a printing press. They don't have a currency that they create for the economy to use. The states are all currency users. They are using the federal government's currency. The provinces are all currency users. They're using the Canadian federal government's currency. And that goes for every sovereign, whether they have states or regions or whatever. So when you have devolved government, those devolved aspects of the hierarchy within the political sovereign are all currency users. Okay, whatever it is that you might call them. When you have government at a regional or local level, those are all currency using entities that rely on the central authorities' public monopoly of the currency. Okay? And that needs to be taken into account, because what that means is, I live in the state of Massachusetts. When the Massachusetts Treasury spends, that really is tax dollars. Okay, that is definitely tax dollars. When the Massachusetts government spends, it is spending from tax dollars collected at the state level from whatever means it may use to collect that money. And when it borrows, it's often borrowing from the federal government, or it's receiving some sort of grant, or what's known in the United States as block grants to the states in order to finance that spending. So states do have to finance their spending or borrow, and regions or provinces or what have you, depending on the country in question. So absolutely good point. Now, yes, the savings accounts versus checking accounts, that terminology, what those correspond to is at the Federal Reserve, whenever you hear reserve account, okay, that is fancy econ speak for a checking account at the Federal Reserve. That's all it is. The central bank of every country is just a bank of banks. So the reserve accounts at those central banks are just checking accounts, okay? And then the treasury accounts, often referred to also as securities accounts, those are, as One Dimension, those are savings accounts. So the treasury accounts at any central bank, when you hear that term, think savings account. Okay, now let's link this to the notion that we owe the Chinese a ton of money. Here's what happens is that the Chinese export stuff to us, right? We have this huge trade deficit with China in the case of the United States. So what do? We are giving the Chinese dollars for products that they sell to us, right? Now, the Chinese have a choice. They can keep those dollars at checking accounts with US banks, and in the case of the Chinese government, a reserve account, a checking account at the Federal Reserve Bank, but they would prefer to earn some interest for those dollars that they're getting for the goods and services that they sell us. So what happens? No problem. Those dollars are moved from their reserve accounts, therefore their checking accounts, into securities accounts, therefore savings accounts at the Federal Reserve. And in exchange, they're given a bond. That's how it works, is we're moving the money from here, from this account, a checking account, to a savings account, and here is your bond. Okay. Now, is there any problem in paying this? No, because when those bonds come to be matured, we're simply moving the money back from their savings account to their checking account. And that's literally, this is not figurative, this is literally the operation that the mid-level bureaucrats at the Federal Reserve Bank take to make this happen, to pay the Chinese this quote debt that we owe them. This is only debt in the sense that all currency everywhere in the world is debt by virtue of being an IOU. Now, what do I mean by this? Okay, because this sounds a little abstract, but it's really important to get a handle on this. All right, when you take out a bill, and actually in the UK, it's interesting.
In the UK, yeah, it says I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5, right?
Yes, which means if you take that $5
to the Bank of England,
they promise to give you a £5 pound note in exchange. Okay.
That's which is like,
yes,
because it used to be silver, right? There's the idea behind it.
Yes. But under fiat, it's, hey, you know what? That thing will always be worth what it says on the paper. So 100 years from now, assuming, we still live under the same system, you can bring that £5 note to the Queen, and she promises to give you another one. Okay, doesn't matter what's happened to the purchasing power since, it'll always be worth £5. All right, and that's what that means.
And this is definitely like a good time to tie into what purpose of taxes are, right? Because you said we should get into the purpose of taxes. This is directly related, because a big question people will say is, okay, so if our currency isn't backed by gold or silver, then what gives it value?
Right.
That's the ultimate question.
It's so great. Yeah.
And the thing that you often hear libertarians, or a lot of like the colloquial understanding tends to be, is that it's based on faith, that we just believe in the U.S. government or believe in the British government. That's not what is actually the value of the currency. What gives the currency value is that you have to pay taxes on it. And what makes you pay taxes? State force. The state has a monopoly on violence. It's able to make you go to jail if you don't pay your taxes. And what does that mean to like create value for the currency? Well, when you create value, when you have a tax, people need to save a certain amount each year to pay that to the government, right? So this tax creates literal demand for that currency, to hold that currency, right? And this can increase the value of it. And sometimes this is also can affect the exchange rates also. So for example, why does China have barely, like, very, very low taxes, despite spending a lot of money? Well, China actually wants a fairly low exchange rate. China wants to have a low exchange rate so that they can be very competitive when exporting. What does that mean, competitive? Well, with US dollars, you can get more Chinese goods than, let's say, Japanese goods, because the currency of, the Chinese currency is worth a lot less. That's what they mean when they devalue their currency. So, but if you want to, import more, you're a country that relies on, it has a more developed consumer-based society, you want to import more, it might be beneficial to have a much more stronger exchange rate so that, you can get more for your buck, basically. So like, what on a federal level, why do we have taxes at all? That's the question some people come to after MMTs. If they don't fund spending, why do we need them? Well, you need to create value for your currency too. And the other thing, as Sam already mentioned, is inflation, right? So if you have too much money chasing too few goods, that can cause inflation, because there's a lot more aggregate demand, a lot more spending. People have spending power, and you have the same amount of goods or a decreased amount of goods, which happens many times in inflationary periods throughout history. The prices go high. But the thing MMT theorists also asks is, why does the prices go higher? Well, we look at who sets the prices. This is the question that typically neoclassical economics avoids entirely. They think that almost prices going up and down is some sort of natural phenomenon that just the currency
Supply and demand
devalues.
Whatever, right?
Yeah, but the markets are made up of people, of individuals, and individuals, some with more power than others. Who sets prices? The people who are in charge of the means of production. So this is like business owners. This is, the people who are selling the goods. And who ultimately has the most power overall in setting prices? And that is the government. The government can very much manipulate prices by either just something like price controls. That's how, for example, all kind of countries use price controls. The America and Britain in World War II, or more infamously, obviously, like the Soviet countries. You had price controls to keep prices artificially very low while still spending a lot on money and all sort of things. Some things good, some things not so good, and so this is the other thing that MMT theorists like to ask is the price setter. And this is, I think, especially Warren Mosler does an excellent job at highlighting this, is the government is ultimately like the monopoly price setter. Obviously, that doesn't mean that's the only one who sets prices, but has the most power to do so. It can compete with the private sector at a strong level because it can create currency. It can also nationalize industries. It can control industries. It can set price controls, all sort of ways. So when people say, how do we deal with inflation? Right? It's not actually that complicated of a phenomenon as people sometimes think it is, right? It's no coincidence why you see when inflation goes high, inequality also tends to increase, because some people are getting very rich from raising prices super high. As we're seeing, there's no hyperinflation in the USA and around the world now, but there's definitely rising inflation because there's a wide variety of reasons for this, that I touched on in my video. But one big reason is after the reopening of most economies, following the pandemic, the pandemic's still going on, but following the reopening of economies, you have a huge increase of demand, but for the most part, supply has stayed the same, actually decreased, because a lot of small businesses have decreased. So you have a lot of the price setters, the businesses, taking advantage of this huge demand by spiking prices very high. And they're allowed to do that because this is a quote unquote free market economy, right? So they're able to take advantage of this. And you see, if you've seen that meme circulate everywhere where it says, inflation is at the highest in 30 years. And it says corporate profits are at the highest level in this many years. And it's not a coincidence, right? So this is something that I think MMT, more than other schools of thought, does a good job, is really looking at inflation, because the criticism that, some brain dead, like neoclassical economists like to throw at MMT is that MMT doesn't think about inflation. It just doesn't consider it. But actually, I would say more than any other theoretical school of thought, MMT has the most sophisticated understanding of inflation.
Yeah, I agree absolutely that I think that MMT has the most sophisticated understanding of inflation over all schools of economic thought. I did want to kind of push back or clarify or give a warning on one thing that One Dime mentioned, which is that the too much money chasing too few goods. So it's not the money supply, the high-powered money supply, meaning money that has been spent into existence by Congress as such, okay, that leads to the chasing of too few goods. Yeah. But more specifically, it's too much spending chasing too few goods. We shouldn't make the assumption that the amount of money in the economy alone is going to lead to chasing a not enough available product by virtue of there being that additional money. How do we know that there's too much spending, right? We know that there's too much spending relative to what's being produced because of inflation. When we see inflationary pressure, one of the places that we look is demand pull inflation, which is what One Dime was describing. So it's more accurate to say too much spending chasing too few goods. Now, just to really kind of
also, it depends on the price setters too, right? Like that's the thing that Milton Friedman obviously leaves out when it comes to too much money spending too few goods, is who's controlling the price of that goods, and also what is controlling the supply of the goods. Because one thing I forgot to mention in my little explanation there is obviously supply chain crisis during COVID is a big factor in inflation, because
Mm.
when you have a lot of ports closing down, you have a huge delay into as to how fast goods can get to places. Also, oil prices affect this, because when oil prices spike, everything gets more expensive. Transportation gets expensive. Thus, the goods often that are imported get very expensive. So like there's all these factors, right? So it's obviously more complicated than like inflation being a monetary phenomenon whereby there's too much money chasing too few goods.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to inject tomorrow, say, a random trillion, and it's never random, I should point out, money is created, high-powered money and bank credit are always created for a purpose. In the case of bank credit, it's always to give somebody a loan for which they need it, for some personal individual purpose as an agent in the economy. When it comes to spending by the legislative branch, and these are the only ways that money can get into the economy, right? The money that is high powered, therefore never has to be paid back, is money that is crossing from the government sector into the private economy. That's our money supply. That's what's known as the net money supply. And why net money supply? Because it's the money minus the credit money that exists. The credit money has to be paid back. It nets to zero, right? The loan creates the deposit. Deposits don't create loans. Banks are not lending out from your deposits. The money multiplier is a myth. So your liabilities are the bank's assets, okay? Your liabilities are the bank's assets. The bank's liability is your asset. So what does that mean practically, right? So you go and get a mortgage. So the bank's liability in that sense is the money that they have just lent you, right? That's the bank's liability, but that money is also your asset. Okay, because you can now buy the house with that money. All right. So what is on the other side of the accounting ledger? What is your liability? It's the promissory note. It's the legal document that you signed that says you have to pay that money back. And what is the bank's asset on the other side of the ledger? It's the promissory note. Your liability is the promissory note. It's the bank's asset, right? So accounting identities, and they net to zero. But in the case of the US government, because it's crossing sectors, when you take a loan out of the bank, that's money that's created inside the private sector that doesn't go outside of it. It doesn't cross over to the government. Okay, it's the credit money is staying with you. So you have gotten a loan. That money is now in the economy. And what are you doing? You're going out into the economy and getting that money from somewhere to pay it back. So that money that was created for you by the bank is netting to zero because it has to be paid back with money that's already in the economy somewhere. Okay, you can't. The government's not going to say, yes, Mr. Smith, sure, we will create new money for you to pay off that mortgage. Now they can, in case of a crisis, and in certain situations, it might be a good idea, but all credit money generally nets to zero. And therefore doesn't change the net assets of the private sector, whereas all high-powered money, all money that is spent, therefore, by Congress, changes the net assets of the private sector. It injects new dollars that add to the national debt, which is really the national savings. Now, when you think about that, and One Dime alluded to this as well, he said, look, there are instances, though, when a country has external debt that's denominated in a currency other than their own, where that is not a part of their national savings. He alluded to this, and that's absolutely true. So your national savings is all of the money, is your national debt, okay, is all of your domestic national debt denominated in your own currency minus any external debt denominated in another currency. So if I'm the Republic of Sam, okay, and I spend 1 million SAMs into existence, all right, and we'll talk about why I'm spending them into existence to begin with and how I'm getting them accepted, which One Dime was also alluding to. So I've spent this 1 million over the course of my Republic of Sam, I've spent 1 million SAMs into existence, okay? However, I've also had to borrow euros to the tune of 200,000 euros. So I hold these bonds that I'm now saying I have to pay back in euros, right? I've sold euro denominated bonds. The countries that have lent them to me, rather, are holding these bonds that I have to pay back, right? So what I owe in euros, okay, subtracts from that 1 million. So it's 1 million SAMs subtracted by 200,000 euros, okay, is the national savings of my republic. Now, here's where it gets tricky and becomes a problem. What happens if, let's say what happens if it just so happens that the 200,000 euros that I owe, okay, are equal to the 1 million SAMs that I've spent into existence in terms of the exchange rate? Well, guess what? My country is basically broke, right? Because I owe all of everything that I have spent into existence in my national currency, in my own sovereign currency, okay, the equivalent of which I owe in foreign bonds. And the implications of that for developing countries, the global south, are very serious. One Dime also talked about interest rates. I want to rebut something he said there in terms of credit and easy credit when interest rates are low. So what we actually see is borrowing not as a result of so much, or even really at all, except by speculators, but at a macro level, we don't see an increase in borrowing as a result of low interest rates. That's not what we've historically seen. Okay, if you need a loan for something, all right, you're not going to sit there as an individual, as somebody who's not, say, a real estate speculator or a credit speculator. You don't work for JP Morgan. You're not managing a credit risk department for them. You're not managing credit-based assets for some firm. You are an individual in the economy, and you can't afford to fix your car, and you don't have the money, but you have good credit. You're not going to sit there and go, you know what, I can't get to work right now, but I'm going to wait. Maybe in 6 months, the Fed will bring interest rates down. Yeah, you're not going to sit there and gamble on interest rates when you need a mortgage, when you need a loan for something. You're still going to go and get that loan. And so go ahead.
I just want to clarify what I meant also that is you're absolutely right that for the average person and like at an aggregate level, interest rates don't really determine how much money is actually in the economy and how much money people want to borrow, right? That determines that's more dependent on a wide variety of factors. And this, what you're, I think, trying to say is also the reason why MMT theorists, especially Moser, like to argue that raising interest rates will not reduce inflation. It won't actually. Right. So I fully agree with that. But what I'm more trying to say is because people have seen asset prices increase lately, right? It's ever since interest rates were drastically lowered and there's this huge influx of money in the economy. And that is like largely because of the Fed's monetary policy. But why is it assets specifically going up? Yes. That's because the people who are given that money, who actually are borrowing, are people who already have the luxury to use that borrowed money to buy huge assets.
That's right.
So that's important. Yes. So like, that's why it's disproportionately benefiting rich people who are typically, the property owning class, right?
Yes.
Marxist terminology, the capitalist
the rentier class.
Yeah. So, but for the average person, raising or lowering interest rates does not change, whether or not you're going to necessarily borrow. I mean, it can impact like home ownership. It can. But like for among starting businesses and stuff like that, there's definitely more other factors, like the opportunities in the economy, all sort of different things, stuff like that.
The number one thing that we see actually driving credit expansion is inadequate deficits. When the government is not spending adequately to meet demand, people will have to turn to credit. And so when the credit expansion, especially rapid credit expansion, is not a sign of, quote, so-called cheap money, but rather inadequate levels of deficit spending. And that's not the only indicator. The other indicator that we can look at is unemployment. If there's any unemployment in an economy, that is a clear indication that federal spending is too small, that the budget deficit is too small, because the government can purchase any amount of labor and goods and services that it wants, and it can spur demand in the private sector. So capitalism runs on sales. Investment is a function primarily, overwhelmingly of demand. Okay, so when there is unemployment in an economy, it is an indication that firms, that private capitalist entities are not willing to invest at a level in order to clear this what's known as the supply stock of labor. Okay, to hire those people, because the demand for goods and services isn't there, and therefore they don't need to hire the people that to meet demand. They're already meeting demand with the labor force that they're currently utilizing. All right. So when that happens, the government can, first of all, can buy that slack in labor. And by the way, that these terms slack, you have to think of this as like a tub. Okay, you have three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And capital in the machinery sense here. And so you have a capacity of labor. What is your capacity of labor? It's every able-bodied adult who's able to work, right? And that tub is full to some degree, okay? And as aggregate demand rises, private firms invest and that tub begins to fill to the top. Now, when you get to the top, okay, you've now hit your capacity. But if demand continues to be driven by what? Let's say too much deficit spending. Let's say the government continues to deficit spend after the tub of labor in the economy is already full. That will create inflationary pressure. So what are some of your options? One of your options is to increase the size of the tub. And that's what in econ terms is called creating additional capacity. So increasing capacity. How could you do that? Well, one example would be immigration, right? To increase the pool or total supply of potential labor in an economy, you could increase immigration. And the federal jobs guarantee would buy up any of the unused labor. So in that tub, you have your labor capacity. If you have any slack, therefore, if you have any people unemployed, and the private sector is unwilling to hire them for any reason, even if you've continued to you've increased deficit spending in order to, in an effort to try and spur demand so that the private sector will increase its investment in labor. For whatever reason, if the private sector doesn't want to increase their investment in labor, even as aggregate demand is going up as a result of increased deficit spending, people have more money in the economy by which to purchase goods. But remember, there's also a desire to save. Okay, and this is what I was talking about earlier. If I could spend $1 trillion into the economy tomorrow, but if nobody spent it, it would have no effect on inflation. And like, this is like very logical. And yet the monetarists, the Milton Friedmans of the world, by talking in terms of too much money chasing too few goods, well, you don't know it's too much money chasing too few goods unless people are actually spending it, unless there's demand. Just having that money in the economy alone is not enough to do it. If there is a desire to save for any reason over a desire to spend, then it's not going to be inflationary, even though you're increasing the high-powered money supply.
And there's an excellent example of this, and that is Japan. In Japan, the government actually wanted more inflation and been trying to get inflation. And why do they want inflation? It's because all governments, specifically capitalist governments that want having prices increase at a certain extent, usually like they aim for a 2 to 4 level increase in inflation per year. It's a sign of a healthy capitalist economy because prices are increasing, profits are going up, et cetera, et cetera. In Japan, primarily due to consequences from their economic collapse in the late 1980s and 90s, but more importantly, their aging problem. Like, they have a big aging population, a very small declining workforce, and also declining demand. Because of that, the government has actually, and prices have been going down, which is not a good thing for a capitalist economy. The government has been drastically trying to increase inflation through traditional neoclassical means by increasing the money supply. And they do that heavily, by they did quantitative easing actually before the United States, which, by drastically lowering interest rates and trying to get, a huge increase in in credit and whatnot, but this didn't work at all. This did not increase inflation as expected. And this is actually one of the reasons why many econ departments aren't even teaching the quantity, what is it called again? Quantity theory of money. No longer teaching that anymore. And that's because it's just been empirically disproven. There's other cases too as to why this could be disproven, but Japan is the most evident case, is because they actually were trying to get inflation and did not succeed in doing so. Certainly, if you have more money in the economy, if people aren't actually spending that money, it will simply not lead to inflation.
Yep. So it's true. I mean, the Federal Reserve, even for years throughout the 2010s and earlier, was doing everything it could to try and generate some inflation without realizing that they're not the ones holding the steering wheel. Like lowering interest rates to zero didn't do anything to create inflation. Now, why would they want inflation? What they're trying to do, actually, as Tony alluded to, is increase GDP. Okay. The idea is we increase the amount of goods and services that we're producing. That is a sign of demand, right? What they're really trying to do by, quote, increasing inflation is increase aggregate demand. Increasing aggregate demand puts pressure on the available supply of goods and services, which are being bought up. And then the system has to go and create more goods and services to meet that demand. But in that gap period, okay, there's going to be inflationary pressure because there's not enough goods and services to meet the demand. But then firms turn around and go, oh, okay, we got to quickly go and make more stuff. And that's going to create a steady rise in prices, which is a healthy sign, which is a sign of if your public mission is growth, having 2, 3, 4, maybe upwards of 4, anywhere in the 1% to 4% range is a sign of healthy growth. And that's what he was alluding to by the Japan example. I think we have to also hearken back to the tax liability question. And it's a matter of how to get a currency accepted, because the fact is that anyone on this call and anyone listening to this can create currency, but the trick is in getting it accepted. And how do you get it accepted? Well, what happens with any central authority, and this harkens back to pre-nation states, this goes back to tribal societies where there was a religious authority even, and all currencies it's a measurement. And if you look at the names of currencies, a lot of them are based on some sort of unit of measurement. The shekel, for example, is maybe one of the oldest examples that we have. And so what would happen is there would be some sort of fine that would be imposed. And then that later became, in the world of nation states, a tax. So what do I mean? And this would legitimize, by the way, that central authority that is imposing the tax liability that you have to meet only in the currency that they issue. So let's say it was a religious community thousands of years ago, and the head of that religious community, anytime there was a dispute, would force payment in the currency that that religious authority issued. And that was the only way to resolve the dispute, was to pay it in the currency that religious authority issued. Now, what does that do? That legitimizes that. It is coercive, sure. And we can, there's an argument to be had about the degree to which that coercion might be, in some sense, consented to by virtue of politically accepting that central authority. Now, in the case of a nation state, how does it work? Okay, you start the Republic of Finn, all right? You start the Republic of Finn because there's political support for the Republic of Finn. Great. Now, here's your problem. You have this citizenry, right? And the citizenry expects certain things of you by virtue of you having set up a Republic of Finn. Like what? Like building roads, bridges, hospitals, providing for the common defense. So you need an army now, right? Okay, you say, geez, how am I going to get, if I'm going to last, if I want this to work, I'm going to need people to do all of these things that they expect me to do for them. How do I get them to do it? All right, here's how you get them to do it. You levy a tax and you say the tax is only payable in fins. And who's issuing the fins? You are. And then you say, well, how do you, and then people go, okay, well, how do I get the fins? And you say, no problem, come dig this ditch.
You got to work and then
bingo.
Some of that then goes back into the system, right?
Yes. Now, exactly. It's all right, pick up the shovel, pick up the gun, do this, do that. Now that work is legitimizing you, right? What are you doing? You are provisioning yourself as a political entity because people expect something of you. And in order for you to get them to do it, you have to levy a tax liability that can only be paid in the currency which you issue. Now, but here's the thing. Are you issuing just enough currency for them to pay the tax liability? No. What you're doing is you're spending money, you're spending currency in excess of the liability that you impose. Why? Because you want to satisfy two things. One, the demand for anybody in that economy that you just created by virtue of issuing the currency into it. You're satisfying their demand to save, and you are satisfying their demand for goods and services that may now be produced in that economy's private sector, okay, that they may want, all right? So you've essentially established the economy by spending more money than your tax liability requires.
So I have a question about, you were talking about unemployment earlier. So if that's the case, if everything you say, if we just say, well, okay, that's all true. So then why is there unemployment? Is it just a case of like, there's just this kind of catch up, this time delay between, or is it some political reason why there's unemployment? Because it seems to me like we could just click our fingers and make loads of government jobs and it's sorted, right? It's fixed.
This is where I don't think MMT has the answer, but maybe Sam will disagree.
Go ahead, Wanda, if you want to start.
Yeah, well, I mean, like many theories, MMT can't explain everything. It explains what it seeks out to explain, right? And that primarily is modern money. But when it comes to unemployment, one can take the view that policymakers are merely unaware and are merely stupid. And I can see why some espouse this view, because a lot of politicians purport to want to increase jobs, right? Like Trump says we need to bring the jobs back. But this doesn't seem to happen.
Party in the UK is the same.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and same in Canada too. But you tend to see is that they still champion policies that lead to higher unemployment. For example, most infamously with the onset of neoliberalism with Ronald Reagan led to significantly higher unemployment.
Right.
Marxists would argue that this is actually more of a natural state of capitalism. And that's because capitalism requires what Marx called a reserve army of labor, which is basically a portion of the population which essentially is not allowed to work or is kept from working or incentivized not to work in some form. And why is this? And that's because if you have a pool of unemployed people who aren't working, it basically creates a sort of threat for the people who are working so that they can easily be fired. So if there's a scarcity,
you can be replaced because there's all these people who need jobs.
Precarity, employment precarity,
precisely. So if everyone had a job, right? You had a job guarantee, as many social democracies did, or even America and Britain did in their times when they had welfare capitalism, right? During when labor unions were real strong to demand all these things in the first place, and there was socialist and anarchist movements globally. But you see, the natural state of capitalism, though, prefers an pool of unemployed people, and that's because if everyone has a job, you can quit your job theoretically and move to a different job, and this is not good for the employer's power, right? The employer wants to have more power over their workers so that they can, number one, dictate more orders to them without people having the threat to leave, and also to give them less wages. To give them lower wages too, right? It's much harder to unionize. It's if you have a pool of unemployed and there's a scarcity of jobs available, because then workers have to compete with each other for the jobs, and you have this system where we have job creators rather than worker exploiters. So as a result, able to give more relative power to the capitalists, and also more profits too, because maybe not this will lead to lesser economic growth overall, because you tend to see when employment is at its highest, economies do better in terms of like overall growth. But for capitalists, they have more power and often more profit when there's a pool of unemployed people, so that they can pay less wages, right? And this is why similar reasons to why they hate unions too. The capitalists hate unions too for this reason.
I think those are really excellent points of discussion to be bringing up. And I would say that I think given the choice between meeting additional profits through additional output versus price gouging, firms will choose price gouging because it means leaving a certain percentage of the population in occupational precarity, right? In worker insecurity. And that leaves them to not have to be, that leaves capitalist firms in a position where they are not weakened against the power of labor. Because as Wondheim pointed out, if you have a very tight labor market, which means that there's very low unemployment, and increasing demand, then that means that employees have their pick of the litter when it comes to who they want to work for, and can chase higher wages. Like, okay, who's going to pay me more? There's a lot of flexibility in terms of who's hiring and where you can go. And we actually saw that during the so-called golden age of capitalism in the United States, that 45 to 1974 period, strong labor unions, near full employment economy, and people could easily go from job to job searching for better conditions and higher wages. Now, firms are going to, it's clear that capitalist firms will respond, to quote Bill Mitchell, actually, they will respond to increased sales demand by producing goods and services. And in order to produce those goods and services, that's end quote. And I'm saying, and if in order to produce those goods and services, they have to hire more people, they will. But to a point, right? They would still prefer some degree of worker insecurity. And if they can make up for those lost profits that they would otherwise receive by producing more goods and services that would require hiring more people, by instead price gouging, then they will price gouge. And that actually takes us to the economic climate that we're in right now, which is dangerous in a number of ways and has a number of extremely dangerous, especially if you're concerned about fascistic tendencies, especially in the United States. Right now, the United States is running, depending on the month, but throughout 2022, either a balanced budget or a budget surplus. This is extremely dangerous. What that means is, because the government's surplus is our deficit, when the government is running a surplus, we are forced to either dip into our savings in order to spend, and by we, I mean every entity in the private sector, you and me on this call.
All currency users, like you said.
All currency users, Microsoft, Amazon, me and you and Tony, right? All of us have to now either dip into savings or borrow. And what we see, unsurprisingly for MMT, through the MMT lens, is that there's an explosion of credit. Even as interest rates are going up, there is an explosion of credit. Why? Because there's an inadequate amount of deficit spending. And yet demand, there is still all of this demand that now people can't satisfy through income alone. And we see them borrowing to make up the difference. This is a dangerous situation. It is a recipe for a potential asset bubble. It's very difficult to predict where an asset bubble may find its roost, but it could be the housing market again. It could be the crypto market. I think the crypto market is ripe for this. I also think potentially the housing market is ripe for this. So if Biden continues to deficit spend, continues to run these surpluses and not deficit spend, these bubbles, this credit expansion will continue to increase, and could create it's the recipe, it's the conditions for a potential recession. And now here's the thing, as it stands, the credit expansion is providing a buffer. Okay, so we don't see a recession right now because the credit is temporarily, if you will, substituting for the lack of fiscal high-powered money being spent in the economy. But that can only go on for so long.
So just very quickly, is that the reason why he's doing that? Is to put off the recession? Is that like what he's thinking? Why he's doing
right?
That?
So the reason,
because otherwise, why would he do it, right?
Like, right. Well, because he thinks that I mean, this is literally willful ignorance on his part. He thinks that the running a surplus, running a balanced budget is good for the economy, that it will help thwart a recession, when in fact it will help catalyze one. Okay, it is beckoning a recession, whereas he thinks it's keeping us from one. Okay. Right. And that is the problem. And the Democrats in this country will run on this. They will run in the midterms. And if this goes on long enough, in the next presidential election cycle, the general election cycle, on having run these budget surpluses and these balanced budgets, which are strangling the economy, forcing people to go to the bank and borrow, forcing corporations to borrow much more than they ever would have otherwise, forcing us to borrow much more than we otherwise would have, creating the conditions for an asset bubble, all things that are pro-recessionary that he thinks are anti-recessionary. Okay, literally draining our national debt, which is the national savings of the country. At any given moment, we're all competing for the dollars that exist in this economy. The credit dollars that have to be paid back, so they net to zero. They're not a part of our national savings. But all of that money that's been spent since 1786, that is our national savings. That is our national savings. And so we are competing for that money, plus the credit money, but that's not part of the national savings because it has to be paid back. And if you cut off what's coming in as there is still demand for goods and services, now all of a sudden there's not enough there to meet our demand, right? And there you get into really dangerous political implications. Okay. And so if you end up with a recession, and we haven't really talked a whole lot about the current inflationary pressure, but One Dime alluded to it. He talked about the prices paid by government when it spends. That is, and I mentioned it in my introduction. I said that the price level is a function of prices paid by the state when it spends, and that's true because the state has a monopoly on the currency. And so even without price controls, what the government spends on any commodity is an absolute price by which markets set a relative price. So look at our situation with oil right now. Okay, it's not just you and I that are getting gouged. It is the government getting gouged when it spends. And the government is the biggest single consumer of petroleum in the country, in the United States. And that's pretty much the case in every country, okay? Because who's using all of that petroleum? It's the military, right? The military is using that more than anybody else. And so the government, what it chooses to spend, or the price that it negotiates to spend when it buys petroleum, then becomes the barometer by which markets set a relative price. Now, I'm going to prove this with labor. I'm going to prove this with what the price paid for labor. The de facto minimum wage in the United States right now is $15 an hour. I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened and how it almost happened overnight. Okay, coming out of COVID, the so-called lockdown, we didn't really have a lockdown, but coming out of COVID restrictions, right? Joe Biden came out and said, the new minimum amount of money that the federal government is willing to pay its lowest paid employee is going to be $15 an hour. He came out and said, no federal contractor will be paid less than $15 an hour. Okay. So our lowest paid employee that the federal government pays for will be paid $15 an hour. Almost overnight, Walmart, Target, all of a sudden started offering $15 an hour minimum wage.
Yeah. So he didn't need to do it by like a legislative instrument. He just did it via his
a market
word.
mechanic, a market
Right.
mechanic. Yeah. Now and by the way, excellent point. The minimum wage law in the United States, the federal minimum wage didn't change. It's still $7.25 an hour, but the de facto minimum wage has changed as a result of what the government pays when it spends on labor in this case.
So I had a little question there. I think it's going from my brain. It's too much to take in, but I think it's fantastic. You were saying that so the government has the ultimate power to dictate prices and all of this, that, and the other. But then when you talk about oil and like the addiction to oil that the military has, that then creates a dependent on the private market to some degree, right? So is that basically the reason why oil prices are going up, because the government can only negotiate using various tools that it has, but it can't dictate the price of oil in the free market?
There you go. Great. Idea, no? So this leads us into the question of price controls. Now, Ro Khanna, who is self-describes himself as is a self-described progressive capitalist, came out with an editorial in the New York Times recently saying that Joe Biden could be doing a lot more to control prices. And it's interesting what he was advocating. He says, look, whenever there are these seasonally based, for example, commodity price dips, that's when the government can go in and do most of its spending. When those prices are low, and then the market will reflect it. But what he didn't advocate is setting price controls, because he was afraid it would upset market fundamentals.
Because he's a capitalist.
Because he's a capitalist. And this is absurd, because first and foremost, the government is already setting the price level by what it spends. Now, if I'm ExxonMobil and you're the government of the United States, and you come to me and go, listen, I'm only going to spend this much money on oil, and I tell you to go F yourself, right? You do have some recourse. The recourse is simple. You say, okay, great. Guess what, ExxonMobil? I'm going to set price controls in the economy that says you can't actually sell your oil for more than this margin of profit. Have a nice day.
Because ultimately that's what the government can like implement with its military and its coercion.
That's right. So now when I have to go to sell to you with a price, and you're the government, now there's a price control in place. Okay, because if I try to say, well, I'm not going to sell to the government for whatever reason, of course I am, because you're such a big consumer. But for the sake of this argument, right? Let's say I refuse to sell to you at the price that you're willing to pay for the oil, and you are the government of the United States, but I'm still selling to consumers in the everyday private economy, right? I'm selling to automobile owners and everybody else who uses petroleum, okay, at inflated prices. But then you turn around and you set price controls on that market, which limit how much I'm able to charge them. That all of a sudden means that now I'm also charging you that amount that you have set the price control at as the federal government, or less, right? So you've set a price control for the general economy at a certain level, but you are the currency monopolist, which means I'm coming now. Now it's like, okay, well, I guess we're back in business, American government. How much do you need? Like at the price control level. Okay, so the question is whether or not they want to do it. It's not whether or not it's economically feasible. That's not the problem here. The problem is
wouldn't they want
to do it? There's no political will for it. There's no political will for it. And so guys like Biden are not only ignorant, he is ignorant. He is ignorant on the economics that MMT elucidates, but he's also willfully ignorant in that he doesn't want to investigate it. He doesn't want to consider it. And so, it's often said, like Stephanie Kelton will point out, for example, that the insights offered by MMT are actually very good for the private sector, for capitalist firms, because capitalism runs on sales. And when you understand like where your level of like constraint is before you hit inflationary pressure, great, you can spend right up to it, right? So you can increase demand up to that point. Okay.
But it's also
So
bad for capitalism too, because it lets people know what they can have, which is the real reason I think
right.
that they're willfully ignorant, right?
Politically, it's
Because
bad for
because
capitalism because if you
yeah,
tell people, hey, guess what? You can have more time and resources. Well, guess what? In the long run, that might actually threaten the system because now their control over you is in jeopardy in the long term, possibly even in the midterm. And I tell people, I'm like, look what happened in the United States in the 1960s, early 70s. People had time and resources. There wasn't an employment problem, okay, among the general population.
that's when you had the most dissent.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So the economy
precisely.
was running great, no problem. But that left people a lot of time, to think.
Too much time to
Gee,
take psychedelic substances and question
yeah, right.
the
Exactly.
whole concept of the government and the economy.
Yep.
Right?
Bingo.
Precisely.
Bingo.
Yeah. So there's no excuses, right? If MMT was acknowledged, there wouldn't be that many excuses, to implement austerity and all these policies. This is the thing. Our systems are no longer justified by divine right, and we acknowledge that our systems are socially constructed, right? But if we acknowledge that these social constructs of neoclassical economics are false, of course this gives people like a huge political awakening to to change their destinies, and of course they can't have people accept this truth, which is contrary to the idea that espoused by many libertarians who like to critique MMT, and even some Marxists who say that MMT is acknowledged or practiced by the state, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, not only is Biden trying to balance the budget, but there's no way I can really see capitalist governments maybe perhaps if there's a more revolutionary radical movement, I could see a pro MMT social democracy being elected. I could see that happening. But the current state of the Democrats, that's just far from the case. The Democrats are still very much neoliberal. And Biden is really like a child in front of a steering wheel and operating a massive state apparatus that is frankly beyond his control. And that's not something I excuse him in any sense. I don't think I'm like giving him any excuses, but he's not sitting here, really thinking that long term about the policies and whatnot. He's surrounded by capitalist advisors and pro-business lobbyists. So
how much can he really do in that situation, right?
That's true. And you have to understand that like there is a certain class of folks in any economy that has capitalism as a feature that even if they fully understood MMT, it was in their best interest to misrepresent it. And that's the rentier and credit class. Any business that relies on a credit heavy economy that is overwhelmingly reliant on credit is going to do everything it can to try and discredit MMT. Because for example, private equity firms, they're a really good example. So if there's inadequate aggregate demand, businesses fail. That's just a fact. You don't have sales, you're going to go under eventually if you have inadequate sales for too long, right? Okay, so private equity firms, what do? They come in and they buy up all of the abandoned assets of a failed business and sell them off, or they restructure that business. And so they absolutely love the credit economy because when they see companies having to borrow and don't have cash on hand, if a company has debt, if any business, big business has debt, right? That's great for them because they get to come in and buy that company or pieces of that company off at a discount. And there are a significant piece of the financial sector in the United States is devoted to this kind of restructuring and coming in when a business fails and selling off assets that they purchased for dirt cheap. Now, again, that happens after a credit-based economy. And we saw this actually in the 90s. And, MMT has an excellent track record on looking at, well, when did these bubbles occur? After what kinds of conditions? And you look at the dot-com bubble that burst in 2000. Well, guess what? The Clinton administration ran a budget surplus in the many years preceding that bubble bursting. It was the Clinton surplus that actually created that bubble. And then it eventually burst because he continued to run budget surpluses.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it wasn't until after we started running deficits again. And this is the thing, like in terms of MMT, quote, informed policies, Republicans have done a much better job.
I was just thinking the same thing. I'm like, hang on a minute. Does that mean that the conservatives and the Republicans were basically kind of economically right all along?
Well, here's the thing.
Or is it like, well, that's just too binary way of looking at it, right?
What they chose to spend the money on are not things that I would choose to spend them on, right? It's the military. But even look, when you spend on the military, when you spend on the Department of Defense or any of these things, that's still money that is going into the economy. None of the money can get into the economy without someone doing business with the government first, and that agent of the government, that first entity that does business with the government, is a privileged position. And I should point this out for your audience. The money in every single country can only get into the economy in one of two ways: what's known as a transfer payment in economic terms, which means it's a money for nothing. Okay. Yeah. Social Security in the United States, perfect example of a transfer payment. Unemployment insurance, paid at the federal level, that's a transfer payment. It's money for nothing. Okay. Now, I mean, not nothing in the social or abstract sense, but in the economic sense. Okay. Now, all of the other money can only enter the economy by the government doing business with a firm or an entity in the private sector. Okay. Or the government doing that job itself. And then all of the people that they employ are still, even though they're, quote, working for the public sector, they're still private sector agents. They still spend their money at a supermarket that's
they're currency users, right?
They're currency users. The grocery store that they spend their money at isn't owned by the United States of American federal government, isn't owned by the federal government of the United States. So they're currency users, right? So they're still agents of the private sector.
Yeah. Yeah. So can I ask quickly, because I'm fascinated by these, my understanding of economics was very basic. I've heard many of these things. So you've really kind of stitched a lot together during this, this dialogue. And one thing I'm fascinated by is pragmatics. So I know that you're working with a few organizations, Sam, and one time you're doing YouTube videos, which is kind of a different pragmatic approach, because I guess first you need to understand it, right? But let's say someone's listened to this entire episode.
I'm the propagandist. That's
right,
like that's my role. It's like the you know how the right has had the neoliberals spread their ideas throughout institutions and like popular medias. That's kind of what I see myself doing. And then there's all sort of other aspects too. Like we need to build our real organizations too. We need to,
So this is my question. What can listeners do? How can they get involved? What can they pragmatically do if they find this information fascinating and they feel like they want to use this lens of MMT to make some kind of difference to society or economy or whatever? What would your guys' recommendations be in a pragmatic sense?
That is such a tough question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but
no, and I'll tell you, but here's the thing: it shouldn't be. But the way that our political system is structured, here's the thing: one of the things that I would encourage people to do with this information, once they have a basic grasp of once they have a grasp of the basics, the things that we've outlined, and by the way, some things that I would recommend, and I think that One Dime would agree with me on these. For anybody who really wants to get this down pat, there's a 55-page pamphlet. You can find it for free on the internet, written by Warren Mosler, Mosler, called The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. Okay.
And very easy to read.
Very easy to read. Now, here's the thing. MMT is not difficult. The difficulty with MMT and understanding MMT is around the paradigm shift.
Yeah. It's going to see debt as being like completely the opposite thing, right? It's and this key debt, this word debt is, I think, what's confusing people. Right?
Yes, it is. Because the word itself, including the word deficit, we think of as a negative thing, something lacking. There's something lacking. And that it is a big part of it is around the verbiage and the terms and our understanding of, absolutely. So there's a consciousness shift that is difficult, but the material itself is actually very easy. Your brain is going to have a difficult time because you were indoctrinated to think about
if you're not
all
used
of this
to
in a certain
switching
way.
worldview, right?
Yeah. So there's that. And then, of course, there's the New York Times bestseller, The Deficit Myth by Dr. Stephanie Kelton, which I also highly, highly recommend.
Yeah.
So those two books, which are very easy to read, the Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds book is more technical, but I would have people start there, because if you can understand, you get yourself to a point where, okay, I've got these 55 pages down pat, everything else becomes much easier. Now, what can they do practically to take direct action around some of this? Okay, I'm sure lots of people in your audience are involved in all kinds of different groups. They're on the streets, they're online. They are involved in political campaigns or political organizations, whether they're involved in the parliamentary system as it is, or they reject it outright. Wherever it is, they are doing their work. They can introduce this into those organizations, get it into the water supply, because there are so many implications for this. Look, I'm an anarchist. I'm seriously considering never voting again. I've voted my entire adult life. I'm at a point now where I'm considering seriously about never voting again. And yet MMT's insights are just as relevant to an anarchist as they are to a liberal or a conservative or anyone else, to bring
or
it
to a Marxist.
Or to a Marxist. Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's so many implications.
Well, see, here's the thing. I have some unpopular opinions. Well, I only say unpopular because I think some Marxists and MMT people might reject, but there's this thing that right-wing libertarians like to say, is that MMT is a Trojan horse for socialism, and that the way it stands,
of course, call them commies. That'll work, right?
Yeah, and I don't think, and as how it stands now, I don't think that's true, but I think it certainly could be, and I think that's a good thing. And I think
and we have to be clear, by the way, that again, we're not talking about something that we do. We're talking about describing how the system already works and how to get more out of it.
I believe, though, is that MMT taken to its conclusion, like if you take its insights to its conclusion, you would not have our economy organized this way. Like the state would build widespread public housing and universal health care.
That's right.
A wide variety of things we could have. Yeah, we would have lots of funds to start up worker cooperatives, a lot of ways to transition to new entire new economies, right? And because that's the thing people talk about when worker co-ops, because socialists like worker co-ops a lot. The big rebuttal is, where are they going to get the money? It's like, where do capitalist businesses get the money? It's from private banks, right?
They just do business with the government.
Or they get it directly from the government when they do business with the government. And then business that did business with the government to get the money into the economy then goes and does business with another business, who then does business with another business, who does business with, and those people along that chain, they're all hiring people, right? In those B2B relationships all the way down the line.
For sure. And I think another big selling point for MMT is really explaining how some spending can actually be deflationary. And that can be a bit mind-blowing for some people, right? Because it's not only is it not inflationary, some things that we spend lots of money on can be deflationary.
That's
and the two big examples of that are healthcare and public housing in general.
Absolutely.
And that's because this is what's a very big surprise to people. And that was, like, for example, Bernie Sanders' universal healthcare plan is a deflationary event. And that's because it's the state providing healthcare. It'll provide it at significantly lower prices than the way healthcare is now, where you have private companies price gouging and you're really sucking people out of every last penny.
There's some good examples of that with Jeremy Corbyn's plan, right, to renationalize basically the energy sector, the rail network, and the rail network is a fantastic example of money extraction. It's the same thing fundamentally, and perhaps that's why he didn't get in. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, and I'm definitely pro-nationalization, but I don't really think nationalization in itself is, like, for example, socialist. Like, I think it's the way we organize the relations of production, which is where I think Marxist and anarchist theories, I think, have more to offer than MMT does in terms of how do we organize productions that is run by the people who do the labor, right? This is, like, I think very important. The next sort of step, I guess. But also, I just want to finish off about housing is with big public housing programs, ones where we actually seriously on a federal level allocate lots of funding to. This is a huge transformation, because you see public housing now, it often has a negative reputation, and that's because it's often provided by provincial and municipal governments, and it's intentionally delivered to be the lowest standard possible so that it does not compete with the private real estate market. And because if you did have a robust public housing program, to give maybe example, as Vienna, Austria has some of the best public housing in the world. You have a public housing like that on a mass federal scale, you really compete with the private real estate market, and they'll have to lower their prices in order to get people to either rent or buy properties, depending on which they're doing. But this is obviously not good for the investor class, the landlord class.
Yeah.
So they're against this by design. But this is deflationary because prices go down. Actually, ironically, Wall Street Journal published an article about, I think it was Corbyn's public housing program, saying that it would cause real estate deflation, which is the euphemistic way of saying that it'll make housing affordable.
Yeah, and capitalists quite unhappy.
I totally agree, One Dime, with everything you just covered. And I want to touch on the deflationary aspect of like a single payer system in the United States and why it's deflationary. So switching to a single payer universal healthcare system in the United States, in other words, the government as insurer, it's not the government taking over healthcare, it's the government taking over healthcare insurance, like every other advanced industrialized country and even almost all developed countries on earth, right? Is a deflationary event in the United States. And not only does it not require higher taxes, it actually requires lower taxes because it's a deflationary event. So how does that make any sense, folks? And again, first of all, your federal taxes don't fund any federal programs whatsoever. They are a reserve drain. They get deleted from the economy. Taxes do not finance government spending. Spending precedes taxation. But why do I say that it requires lower taxes? And I would say that because it's deflationary. How is it deflationary? Okay. What we know for a fact, and study after study that's been done in every institution in the United States of any repute that you could possibly imagine, we know, and just by virtue of logic, that because of all of the bloat, the administrative bloat, the CEO salaries, the paperwork, the number of middlemen, the profit incentive itself, that the number of resources, meaning people you need to employ to keep the private healthcare insurance industry going, okay, is much greater than the number of labor resources you would need in order to operate a single payer universal system. So what that leads to is a release of resources, which is a fancy way of saying, okay, the net effect on employment from going to a private health insurance system to a public health insurance system is negative, okay? The number of people you need to run the public system is much, 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 much less than the number of people you need to run the private system, okay? So those people who were once employed in the private system, and we are not talking one-to-one here, we're talking at a macro level, all right, are now unemployed. Yeah. So why lower taxes? Because if you want to increase demand, which leads to investment in labor, there's two ways to do it. One, you can increase government spending. Okay, you can increase the size of your yearly deficit, which means you're increasing ultimately the size of your national quote debt. That's one way to do it, to spur demand. The other way to do it is to cut taxes. If you cut taxes, that leaves more of that money in the economy. Okay, so now that national debt, which was going to be lowered by a certain amount based on the taxes that you paid, and then offset by that deficit and hopefully deficit plus, the alternative is, instead of more spending, is less taxes. Okay, they can have an equal effect depending on the degree to which you apply them. All right, and so a single payer system would not require an increase in taxes. That would be terrible. that would increase the deflationary force of transitioning from the current system to the single payer system. Instead, we would want to lower taxes to, quote, pay for single payer healthcare to offset the deflationary effects that such a transition would have on the economy.
But it wouldn't be even a total transition from one model to the other model, because if you look at Europe, there's many different. Like the state healthcare is just universal pretty much within Europe and in the UK. But then there's a private system that competes with it to some degree. Like everybody is entitled to that free insurance, so no one has to like break a leg and then think, oh, fuck, what am I going to do? So everyone's covered. But if you want to like skip the queue and go to some fancy pants hospital, for your hip operation, whatever it is, you can pay 20 grand. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of those people are still going to be employed in the private sector. That's kind
but here's the thing that you also have to keep in mind. It's not like those resources that are released, that labor that is lost as a result of transitioning. Let's say that the private healthcare, the private insurance system in the United States goes completely out of business as a result of a single payer system, which I hope it does. Okay, because it cannot it cannot compete with a single payer system. And most people don't realize 70 to 80% of our entire healthcare infrastructure in this country, I'm talking the actual hospitals and medical centers, are public. They are public. They are public. They are not private. They're
owned by the government already, right?
They're either owned by, they're in what's in the United States, what's very popular is private-public partnerships.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're publicly owned, but there is some sort of private investment, but they're not for profit. Our best hospitals, of which I am less than a quarter of a mile away right now in the United States, Mass General Hospital, those are not for profit entities. Okay. So we're not talking about changing the healthcare infrastructure. We're talking about changing the insurance. Who is the insurer of your healthcare coverage? Okay. And that is a very deflationary event. The private health insurance industry in the United States is incredibly inefficient, and nobody disputes this. So to go to a single payer system where it's no longer you and a middleman, but it's no longer you, a middleman, your doctor, or the doctor's office. It's just you and the doctor's office, is a much more efficient system. And so, but the point was that those people who are going to lose their jobs as being like basically administrative paper pushers inside the private health insurance industry, it's not like they don't have any transferable skills to outside of the health insurance industry. Okay, they have plenty of transferable skills. So whatever the single payer system cannot absorb of those released resources from the private healthcare insurance industry can be absorbed by other industries, so long as there is sufficient aggregate demand to get them hired, right? And that's where either lowering taxes to, quote, pay for it, or increasing government spending come into play. So in other words, for us to get single payer healthcare in this country, not only do we not have to raise taxes, we actually either have to lower taxes or increase government spending after going into that system.
And this sort of brings us to which is something we very much talked about in this conversation, but it's worth just highlighting again, and that is the real constraint of government spending is not the amount of money. We mentioned inflation, but it's resources. Resources is what matters. We shouldn't be asking how will we pay for it? How much money is this going to cost us? How will we resource it? Is the actual physical infrastructure there? And this is one of the insights of MMT that I think is also compatible with Marxist theories of value and labor. And that, who creates the actual value, who creates the things that we consume and use, and that is labor. It's ultimately what makes all of this happen. And if we have that, and we have, the natural resources to make things happen, we can make things happen. Now, I do want to touch on one more thing, because I can hear people screaming, MMT only applies to rich countries like the United States. And you hear this a lot, that MMT does not apply to the global South. But actually, MMT accounts for things like this in the theories of currency sovereignty.
That's right.
For example, if plenty of countries do not have the luxury of having a lot of natural resources, and thus they need to usually use some sort of foreign currency in order to get those resources. For example, Cuba does not have petroleum. they rely on trading partners to get that petroleum. Usually Venezuela, they rely most heavily on. Back when the USSR was still around, they relied on USSR. Yeah. And, a lot of for example, also countries that are industrializing in general, that start off poor. Plenty of examples of this, but we could think of Bolivia, we could think of China, we could think of Vietnam. Let's look at Vietnam and China, because these are countries run by quote unquote communist parties, and while they have very much like a form of state capitalism, I would argue now, there is a rationale for why they opened up their economies. And that's because they were trying to industrialize, and they needed to get foreign currency to buy some of the technology and physical infrastructure that did not exist there before to industrialize. So what did they do? They opened up first what are called special economic zones, these factory areas where it's almost zero tax, where essentially they exploit their own workforce and get a lot of foreign investment in exchange. Right. And with that foreign investment, you get a lot of foreign currency, which you can use to, invest in technology and more advanced means of production. This is a highly it's still capitalist, right? And it's very exploitative. But you have seen in China and Vietnam do not look the way they did 30 years ago. They're very, advanced in terms of technology, almost in some ways surpassing the USA in the case of China. So this is one thing to understand, is that MMT people aren't trying to say that any poor country can just spend reality into existence. If the physical resources and infrastructure isn't there, you will need to get it from somewhere else. And unless your currency is the dominant currency of the world, you're going to need that other currency to go purchase those things, right? So whether that be US dollars or euros. So this is often an obstacle that some developing countries find themselves in, is that they rely too much. This is one thing that all countries can change mostly, is food imports. A lot of countries rely on food imports from foreign countries, unless they use a foreign currency to import that food. This was a big problem Venezuela had, and a big reason for like their hyperinflation, is they would use their oil revenues to get a lot of foreign currency, which they would use to help pay for oil imports. When the prices of oil went down, they suddenly had all this debt to pay in foreign currency. And of course, they had less foreign currency revenues to pay for these food imports. Things got more expensive. And yeah, one measure of currency sovereignty is how much debt in foreign currency you have. You want the majority of the debt you have to pay to be in your own currency. If it's not in your own currency, you're less currency sovereign. So it's not just about having a currency, right? Mexico has its peso. They have their currency, unlike the EU. EU would be much lower on currency sovereignty, but at the same side, in the same sense, Mexico also does not have full currency sovereignty, because it also relies heavily on the US and Canada for vital aspects of foreign trade, even though, arguably it doesn't need to. Mexico is extremely rich and could be self-sufficient, but this is also by virtue of global trade and free trade agreements that creates a sort of interdependence. Like that, right? Yes. Yeah. So yeah, it's worth clarifying, just because there's this idea that MMT doesn't account for disparities in global wealth and it does. Power, and it does. It totally does.
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad you brought this up, because the real wealth of a nation doesn't change because their economy, even if they're based on how poor or rich in terms of GDP they are. If you have a diamond mine, you have a diamond mine, regardless of whether or not your country has no real infrastructure, has no sustainable agricultural output, has no sustainable water energy management, has no finished value-added goods. And so the real wealth of a nation is its workforce, what that workforce is able to produce, and the raw materials that exist. And from there, those are the sort of natural innate wealth. And then you start to build up value-added goods and services that increase what it is you're able to produce and how self-determined you're able to be. Now, there is, the dilemma. And for people who are really interested in MMT's Insights for the Global South, I recommend a lecture, 44-minute lecture by Professor Fadl Kaboub. That's last name is K-A-B as in boy, O-U-B, one of the preeminent MMT economists who specializes in developing nations. Look up MMT Insights for the Global South, Professor Kaboub, K-O-B-O-U-B. And so what global countries in the global south are subjected to, right? The neoliberal economic model. And to just sort of like run through the bullet points without going into great detail here, I'll leave it for people to check out Fadl's talk. But, it's austerity, debt restructuring, labor market flexibility, export-led growth, so negative terms of trade, financial liberalization, which leads to speculative bubbles, tourism as opposed to resource sustainability, brain drain, right? People leaving, the most highly skilled and educated folks leaving, and increasing all of this external debt in order for them to basically survive and be able to provide any resemblance of a decent standard of living, which they never really get to. It's just constantly chasing their tail to not wind up completely in shackles. There is a way out. And in fact, through the MMT lens, it's the only way out. And that is through renewable energy policy, sustainable agriculture policy, water energy management, conservation policies, south to south trade policies. So these developing nations were seeking solidarity, and then a value-added driven industrial policy. And what does that mean, really? What that means is, if you have all of this wealth, it's not talking natural wealth, right? So let's say you have a lot of oil in your country, but you have to export the oil to get it refined. That's a problem, right? And there are really good examples of this across commodities throughout countries that are in the development stage where they have incredible wealth. The country is maybe very poor, but they have incredible wealth. And the thing is, like, how much you are spending on, if you are exporting all of these things, your natural wealth, that is a real net loss to the natural wealth of your country, to its potential, right? If you're having to export all of these things and rely on other countries to finish them, there are ways around this. And it starts with things like, for most countries, putting themselves on a footing to a 0%, permanent 0% interest rate policy, which we should be running in every developed nation for sure, especially the United States. It involves throwing off the shackles of these really bad IMF deals in order to get, as Wondine mentioned, the desirable currency to purchase the things you either need or to, as I mentioned, refine, finish the natural resources that you have in your own country so that you can then turn around and sell them to people who will want them. I mean, it's an incredibly exploitative system. Think about it. If you have natural resources and then you have to export them, have them finished by a core or developed country, only to then re-import them for use in your own country or to sell to a then poorer country. That is, talk about capitalist exploitation. That doesn't get any worse than that. But there is a way out. And, we have to look at what is the path that these countries can take. What, based on current conditions, what kind of policies based on presuming that their public mission is to get out from under the thumb of the IMF and the World Bank. Let's say that is, for example, a public mission or you would want it to be one of Argentina. Well, Warren Mosler recently, in the last month, did a tour of Argentina, speaking to policymakers, economic organizations, political organizations, and really getting the word out throughout the entire country. And there was an interesting reaction. The official state response, if you will, at the end of his tour to him was, well, Mr. Mosler, you're right. We looked at everything that you were talking about, how our economy functions, our interest rate at 47%, changing that to a 0% rate, implementing a federal jobs guarantee, investing in education, healthcare, all of these things, value-added goods as a more sustainable Sorry, I've got a little bit of background noise, so it
Okay.
should be temporary. But to put us on a path towards sustainability, taking us off a fixed rate exchange system where we're currently pegged to the US dollar and going to a floating point system. They said all of these things make sense for improving our economy and making us more self-determined. However, it'll never happen. And he said, what? He said, you just agreed with me that these are all economically sound policies based on the empirical reality of your country and what could be done to put things on a more ethical path and a more productive path to increase employment. Look, if your goals are to target, which is allegedly of all economics, you're targeting two things: full employment and price stability. And they agreed with him that what MMT offers in terms of insights into their economy, how it is functioning and how it could function better in achieving those two goals, full employment and price stability, that all of that was sound, but that wasn't going to happen, at least not under the current government the current government composition, because, quote, there was no political will for it. He said, what do you mean there's no political will for it? And what they said to him was, look, this is a revolving door with the IMF. We are captured by their interests. And even if, and this is the amazing part, Mosler's proposals for what Argentina could do based on MMT insights would get the IMF paid back faster than what the IMF's current agreement with Argentina was. But this is a quid pro quo in terms of who is captured, what kind of economics is captured by what kind of political power. And there is so much interest in those areas of the IMF, those quarters, I should say, of the IMF that have their thumb on Argentina to keep the system of debt peonage in place because it benefits their political power. Who wants to be the person in Argentina as a parliamentarian, as an executive branch advisor, or as an IMF economist on the Argentina case, if you will, to say, you know what? These austerity programs we've had in place this whole time, turns out they're not only strangling Argentina, but they're not getting us paid. And, we could actually have done this, have this whole thing taken care of lock, stock, and barrel 20 years ago if only we had done these, if only we had recommended that Argentina do these things. Nobody wants to be that person. There goes that faction's political power forever. Forever. It's the same reason why Paul Krugman, despite the fact that he went and visited Warren Mosler in the Virgin Islands, had dinner with him and his wife, with Krugman's wife, sat down. Krugman understood and accepted it all, so much so that at one point he interrupted Mosler to better explain a question asked by Krugman's wife, okay, and then never talked to Mosler about it again, and still is writing op-eds as though he doesn't accept it and that he doesn't think it's accurate, right? And
well, he's a flip-flopper, because what he says is, I heard him got interviewed about MMT, and he said, well, MMT says what we have always already known.
Right.
And he
now the pressure is on so hard that
Yeah.
he's gone from these guys are wrong, even though he met with Mosler, said, okay, that all makes sense, but then publicly stated that it's not accurate. And now, because there's so much pressure coming down, it's harder for him to avoid some of this. It's harder for him to deny so much of this, that he's now saying, oh, well, sure, they might be right, but they're only saying what we've been saying the whole time. You cannot, if you're Paul Krugman and you want to be intellectually honest after learning something new, in his mind, understandably, he's taking a risk. And that risk is, if I come out as the New York Times, having been the New York Times chief economist, chief op-ed economist for what, how many decades now? Okay. And I say, yep, these guys are right. What I'm also saying is, and I've been wrong this whole time, that our models and what I've been telling you about these matters is wrong. There goes the end of his, what political entity is going to ever hire him for advice ever again? What politician, after he's just said, oh, by the way, these MMT guys have had it right and I've had it wrong for the last 3 decades. Okay, I'm the senator from such and such. Why am I going to hire you, Paul? Why don't I hire one of the guys?
Yeah, okay, but who has such a big opportunity to change things for the better? Like me, you, and Tony don't. if I was there, I'd do it and
That's
lose
the
my
problem.
career in a heartbeat.
Yeah,
The problem's
that's why
ego
That's the
fundamentally, right?
I don't
That's the
think we
problem.
can. I don't think we can rely on politicians and these
No, of course
professional
not.
managerial classes. Like that's why,
Agreed.
like you see historically, change happens actually from the bottom. I know it's a cliche, but it's true.
Mm.
Like you change can't happen from the top, right? But it'll only happen from the top if the authorities in power feel a threat to need to appease the public in some way. Whether you can see,
Right.
the tactics of welfare capitalists and social democracy isn't new. We see this as early as like in terms of capitalist societies, like Otto von Bismarck in Germany, right, implementing the welfare state and social security for the first time. Why did he do that? It's not because he was some kind of jolly nice guy. It was because there was, the 1848 revolutions, and there was these huge like social movements were the biggest in Germany and all of Europe at the time. So, and also there's, the French Revolution, all of these.
FDR in the 1930s, after rumblings on the streets by anarchist, communist, trade unionists in the early 1930s, same thing, right? It's not FDR didn't do it because it was some benevolent from on high. It's because he felt threatened, and he's like, okay, I got to appease these guys, or the communists are going to take over the country.
This is my sort of pitch to the sort of more the reformist social democrats types as to why they should become socialists / communists, and the reason why I the pitch I make to them is that what you want isn't possible without the more radical socialists and communists. Like, even if you want compromise, even if that's what you aim for, which I think is a little bit absurd to like aim for a compromise. You don't aim for a compromise. You accept compromise if that's all you got, but that's not what you should aim for. And even if you believe for some reason it's like a class collaborationist utopia, you're only going to get something, you even get a slice of that with the threat of radical movements. And that's, the real pitch I give to social democrats as to why they should, look into Marxism, look into anarchism. Is, we've learned from history is that let's look at the Nordic utopias, right? I say utopias, they're not utopias, but that's often like the vision that a lot of social democrats and reformists say, we just want to be like Denmark and Norway and Finland. Okay, well, why are they the way they are? Well, the USSR was right beside them. It was literally like communism, whatever. If it's maybe not a lot of people's kind of ideal type of socialism, I can totally get why. Regardless, it poses a threat. And there was also the Finnish Revolution, and there was huge trade union movements in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland as well. That made these things happen. The elite doesn't benevolently change its mind or come to conscience. They're willfully ignorant until they have to, at least acknowledge the realities. That's how power itself works. Is why would anyone compromise with you if you have no power? And how do you get power? You build organizations, you build mass movements.
I could not agree with everything that Tony Wondheim just said more. Like 100%. That's exactly how I feel about those matters entirely. Yep.
Nice. Yep. I think that's an excellent point to maybe round off the conversation on. Thanks very much to both of you. It's been an absolutely enlightening conversation, and I really appreciate it. Any final words? I guess there's something, you've made some good recommendations, Sam. I don't know if you have any, Tony, as well. Any kind of like other resources you'd recommend, documentaries, Netflix shows, anything like that people can kind of learn more from?
Of course, I'll have to recommend my own videos when it comes to MMT.
There we go.
And I
One
would
dime
say
on YouTube.
The 3 videos are The Deficit Myth, The Biggest Lie in Politics, and another one called The Problem with Taxing the Rich, which is an MMT diagnosis, an MMT analysis of how money works, and why also, taxing the rich is also just not insufficient for dealing with inequality. And I talk about private property and housing stuff from Marxist perspective. And also the video Origin of Money, which pretty much is more or less a summary of like the MMT theory of the money story, and Draws on a lot of also David Graeber's insights.
Yeah.
And when it comes to other recommendations other than my own work, there's plenty of good materials. Sam mentioned a bunch, like in terms of the books. I've read those. I'd highly recommend them. I have them in the sources in my videos.
Fantastic. So people can search your video, check the description.
Yeah, check the descriptions.
Great.
Yeah, there's podcasts there's stuff like Macro and Cheese. I've been on that podcast before by Steve Grumbine. It's a really good introductory MMT podcast. And then there's one called the MMT podcast. That's also pretty good. When it comes to what someone can do, I in terms of organization, I live in Canada, so I can't really give good recommendations for the US as to what organizations to join. But I would say, join a party, first of all, if you have one. This is difficult in the US because US I don't view as like functionally a democracy in any sense. But if you have like a socialist party or communist party, I mean, join that. It really helps. Sometimes a lot of these parties are often filled with old people with like outdated ideas. So it helps, bring in the fresh ideas.
People are willing to listen to something.
Yeah,
interesting.
Exactly. And so that it's good to join a party if you're, join a union if you can too. But that's, with spreading the ideas, I think it's important to spread ideas to people who have platforms that can further spread those ideas on a mass scale. That's a big thing. It's like if journalists or any big content creators of any sort who have a platform and the interest to spread this ideas, definitely go do that. I think that's important because you need we need more people to simply know that these things that we're asking for and want are possible, and then from there we can really build that
do some
class
pragmatic
power.
things. Lovely. And Sam, any final words as well?
Yeah, I would, as far as other resources and discussions, folks can check out the debates and discussions I've been a part of. If you Google my name, Sam Kangaroo on YouTube, you'll find me on Zero Books Publishing. You'll find me with on the Swolitariats program.
Yeah, we've had him on the Swolitariat. Right?
Yeah, he's a good buddy of mine. I'm a big fan and have some good debate and discussion with him over the last couple of years. And then Derek Varn, I highly recommend. I've been on Varn Vlog. He's great. I've had debate and discussion with him.
He's really good.
Yeah. Zero Books Publishing. I've been on.
It's a great YouTube channel.
Yeah, I've been on there with Derek Varn, but also with Ted Reese. Tony mentioned Macro and Cheese, which I am a big fan of. That's run, as he mentioned, by Steve Grumbine, who is the founder and president of the Real Progressives nonprofit, which works to advance MMT.
And the website for that was realprogressives.org, right?
That's right.
People can check out.
Yeah, people can check that out. Some really great resources and activist resources and educational tools. I will say, as kind of this, and I don't want to leave it on a note of any kind of,
sour note.
Right. But I do understand how difficult and challenging it is to explain this stuff, because the elevator pitch just sounds like another crackpot thing.
People have to be kind of ready to accept it. Yeah.
They have to be, and they more than that, they have to be willing to go further, right? So if you are with an organization and you're talking to somebody who is a lead organizer and you have 5 minutes, it's gonna sound like potentially a dial tone.
I'm gonna arrange a Zoom meeting with you to explain it to them.
Yes, do that.
Give them 10 minutes and Sam will convince you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's and that's what it takes, is saying, look, don't take my word for it. You just told the person, you just told them that their taxes don't pay for any government spending. You sound like a crank. You sound like a nut job. There's no two ways about that, right?
Yeah.
And so hopefully you've started with what money is before you segue into that. But even like trying to get people's attention in person for like that 10 minutes, that's not going to be absorbed. They have to then go further, or they have to sit down with you when they're ready to like, okay, let me take my notes. Let me go check and come back with the right questions when I know what the right questions are, to challenge and think some of this stuff through. And it has to be framed in, look, all of these things that we're told that we can't pay for. And by the way, you know, that's ideologically based. So if you're a Trumper, okay, for them, it's like, this is great for them. These insights are fantastic. I know how I can pay for the wall.
Yeah, they can just pay for the wall, right?
I know how to enlist every able-bodied white person.
It's kind of dangerous at the same time, right?
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
Nonetheless, yeah.
I know how I can get more black men in prison. Like all of the things in terms of whatever your public mission North Star is, you can target with this. And so this is just as useful, unfortunately, for the far right as it is for
a double-edged blade. Yeah.
It is absolutely, because it doesn't change. The empiricism doesn't change based on your politics. And we actually did see Trump, quote, you know, use MMT or operate within that framework of understanding when it came to his tax cuts, when it came to his proposal for the wall, when it came to all kinds of things. And so we have to keep that in mind and let people know, look, you know, there are political implications for this that we have to understand. And we also have to understand that by accepting this mainstream narrative of, oh my God, we're in terrible debt and this will lead to the collapse of everything, that all of this isn't true. And whatever it is that we think we can afford, if we understand it through the correct lens, the correct framework, it'll change our ideas of what is possible. And for people who, you know, they're sick and tired of the bourgeois political system and the way that we've organized parliamentary politics in this country. Look, folks, there are so many implications for what it means to create, if you're a Marxist society based on these insights, because you're going to need some kind of record keeping in order to fuel your production and your consumption. And the same goes for anarchists. So I would leave it there, is that people's creative horizons for what's possible will expand when they understand MMT.
Right. And maybe that could lead to some kind of post-capitalist society in some sense.
Absolutely. I think so.
Great. Thank you very much, chaps. It's been amazing. And let's wrap it up there.
Thank you guys. Really appreciate your time, everybody.